What does a man think when a woman falls silent? It is not a simple question, nor an empty provocation. It is, in fact, a portal, an abyss that opens before the masculine ego, accustomed to being heard, to being answered, to being reflected as in a mirror shaped by the woman's speech. And when she shatters that reflection with silence, he finds himself exposed, and that for many is unbearable. Imagine a room. He speaks, explains, rationalizes, tries to convince. And on the other side, she does not rebut. She does not react. She simply observes. Maybe not even that. She is there, but without granting him the privilege of interpretation. The absence of response becomes the space where he projects everything he fears. Is she disappointed? Did she discover something? Has she given up? Or worse, does she no longer feel anything? Here, silence is not absence. It is raw presence. It is a way of existing that does not bend to the other's expectations. And that is precisely why it disturbs so much. The masculine mind, taught to act, solve, compete, searches for patterns. But silence is not a pattern. It is a break, an absence of immediate logic. Sartre reminds us, man is condemned to be free. And this condemnation reveals itself most clearly in those moments when he loses control of the narrative, when he does not know what you will say, or worse, when you choose to say nothing. At that moment, the man ceases to be in command of the situation and begins to confront his own insecurity, because the woman's silence does not give clues, does not offer relief, does not allow for defense. And what is left? The raw truth of himself. The anguish of not knowing what she thinks, and the unbearable suspicion that she has seen him, truly, without the varnish, without the performance, without the social makeup he carefully constructed. Many men feel threatened in the face of this, not because you attacked him, but because you withdrew from the game. And the game, for them, is the language that gives meaning to the relationship. When you fall silent, he must deal with a void, a space where once there was validation, attention, even submission, and that void echoes something ancient, the fear of not being enough. He begins to try to decipher, is she punishing me? Is she testing me? Does she want me to say something? And each of these questions is an attempt to escape anguish. But the truth is that the silence is not about him. The silence is about you, about your boundary, about your freedom to not have to explain everything, to not need to justify every choice, to simply be. And at that moment, the relationship changes. He must decide what to do with this new space. Will he fill it with honesty or escape? Will he attempt to manipulate, provoke, make you speak? Or will he sit with discomfort and listen to what he never wanted to hear? Sartre speaks of bad faith, that comfortable self-deception where we pretend not to know what we know, where men say, "I don't understand what you want," when in fact they understood perfectly. They just do not want to assume responsibility for dealing with what they heard. But silence, unlike words, does not allow that excuse. It is irrefutable. It cannot be distorted. It simply is. True silence is existential. It is not a game, not blackmail, not punishment. It is revelation. It is the moment when you cease to be the object of his speech and become the subject of your own existence. And at this point, the game flips. Because now it is no longer about what he thinks. It is about what you will do with the power that silence has given you. A woman's silence reveals more than words ever could. It not only dismantles the fragile structures of masculine self-esteem, but it also flings open a fear that few men have the courage to admit, the fear of a woman's freedom. From an early age, many men were taught to see a woman as something to be conquered, interpreted, kept under control. She smiles. He assumes it is a green light. She gets angry. He tries to fix it. She cries. He panics, not out of empathy, but because he does not know what to do with her pain. But when she falls silent, he has no support. The map disappears. The territory has changed. At that moment, she is no longer a piece in his game. She is something else, an uncontrollable presence, a freedom that asks for no permission. And that is intolerable for someone who learned to measure his own worth by a woman's reaction. Sartre teaches us that the other is the mirror in which we recognize ourselves. But he also said, the other can be hell, because the other has freedom. The other escapes us. The other can reject us. And there is nothing more anguishing for a fragile ego than being refused by someone who neither shouts, nor fights, nor begs. Someone who simply falls silent and walks away. This silence becomes an abyss into which the man falls, trying to cling to old certainties, but they are no longer there. And so he must face a fact. She ceases to be a character and becomes the author of her own story. And a woman's freedom, when she grants herself to be, without needing to explain, is something that dismantles the masculine script. Not because she is cruel, but because she finally stopped accepting a role she did not choose. Here is where masculine anguish is born, not from the silence itself, but from what it represents, the loss of control, the evidence that she can think alone, decide I, alone, exist, without him. And for some men, that is unbearable, because they confuse love with control, presence with dependency, partnership with possession. When she falls silent, she affirms, I exist outside of you. And he, who perhaps never stopped to think if he exists outside her validation, feels the ground disappear. At that instant, many resort to the old card, dismissing the silence, labeling it coldness, a game, pride. But all of that is defense, disguised fear of accusation, because deep down he knows she is becoming untouchable, not because she feels nothing, but because now she feels for herself. And what will he do with that? This is the breaking point. The moment he has two choices, confront his own ghosts or try to silence the woman again, with words, with neediness, with promises he himself does not understand. But silence has already shown what was needed. She doesn't need to prove anything. She simply is. There is a common scene, repeated in couples, friendships, encounters. The woman falls silent, and the man says he doesn't understand. But does he really not understand? Or is that a subtle way of escaping the truth? Jean-Paul Sartre calls that bad faith, an essential concept to understand self-deception mechanisms. Bad faith is when we pretend not to be free to avoid responsibility for our choices. It is when we say, I had no choice, when in reality we simply lacked the courage to choose authentically. And when a woman falls silent, many men immediately enter this bad faith mode. They say they don't know what is happening. They claim surprise. They feign ignorance. But their bodies know. Their gaze betrays them. They know. And yet, they pretend not to know. Why? Because admitting they know demands a step that many do not want to take. Acknowledging that the relationship is out of balance, that something was said before the silence, that there was carelessness, emotional violence, disrespect, or simply distance. Admitting that would require change, and change hurts. Bad faith, on the other hand, is comfortable. It is like drawing a curtain to avoid seeing an empty stage. I didn't get it, he says, when what he wants to say is, I don't want to deal with what I got. Bad faith is the most elegant way to flee from oneself. But a woman's silence does not allow that escape for long. It is like a song playing at low volume, but continuously. She neither accuses, nor demands, nor dramatizes. She simply falls silent. And in that silence dwells a weight that bad faith cannot hold for long. He begins to suspect that he already knows indeed what he did, or what he failed to do. That silence is not a puzzle. It is a limit, a no more. And that is where self-deception starts to crack. Some men react with anger. They say you are being difficult. They try to invert the blame. They turn your silence into aggression. But deep down, what they feel is guilt. And guilt, when unaddressed, becomes attack. Others try to bypass it with empty gestures, gifts, affectionate messages, promises. But you feel it. It is tentative. It is palliative. It is fear, disguised as love. Bad faith is not only a lie to the other, it is a lie to oneself. And many men prefer to lie to themselves than to face the possibility that they lost something precious, something they perhaps didn't even know they had until silence revealed it. Because silence does not lie, it only shows, and before it, there remain only two options: keep out, fleeing, or stop. And finally, listen. There is an instant when everything stops. No word, no gesture, no reconciling attempt. The man realizes there are no more levers, nothing he can pull to bring back the woman who now falls silent. It is not just silence. It is an absence of response. A void where once there was dialogue, conflict, or even a reconciliation attempt. And that is where true collapse begins, when he realizes there is nothing left to control. For a long time, a man could rely on an invisible script. He knew how to calm, seduce, manipulate, provoke. It was like playing a game whose rules he knew, even if he hid them. But silence breaks that system. Sartre teaches us that man is a project in constant motion. He is never fixed. He is always building himself over time, in relationships, in the roles he assumes. But when the other refuses to play, the project collapses, and the man begins to fall into himself. Because without control, he is just that, a being thrown into the world with no guarantees, no map, no excuses. In this context, a woman's silence is not just an individual gesture, it is a structural rupture. It is the refusal to be interpreted, to be objectified. It is the end of simulation. And many men do not know what to do with that. Some freeze, enter a state of passive waiting as if she, at some point, would speak again, and with that, return him to the known world. Others react in despair. They try to force a response. They pressure, accuse, demand. Because for them, any word, even a scream, is better than that absolute void. But there are also those who, faced with the abyss, finally understand. They feel fear, an existential fear, not a social one. The fear of not being anything beyond what the other recognizes. The fear of having no identity outside her gaze. And then, for the first time, they ask themselves, who am I now that she has stopped seeing me? This is the cruelest, most revealing moment. The loss of control forces a man to confront his own lack of depth. He, who so often sustained himself on the woman's gaze, now finds himself before a mirror without reflection. And in that mirror, what appears is the void he avoided for years. The awareness that he may have never learned to love, that he confused affection with domination, that he traded intimacy for predictability, that he used the discourse of protection to cover up the fear of losing. It is at this point that transformation becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. The man who crosses this abyss, without trying to manipulate it, without seeking shortcuts, can begin to build something new. A way of being that does not depend on control. But this only happens if he has the courage to remain there, in silence, in the void, without guarantees, because it is there, exactly there, that freedom resides. It is not easy to truly see oneself, not as you would like to be, not as you were taught to appear, but to see oneself, without filters, without the varnish of social roles, without the frame of someone who admires you, desires you, or needs you. Simply, to see oneself. This is the most profound effect of a woman's silence on a man who always constructed himself from her reaction. He sees himself, and what he sees is not always beautiful. Sartre describes this feeling in his work, nausea, an existential discomfort that does not come from something external, but from the very perception of being. A nausea before the realization that we exist, without justification, without a given essence, without a predefined role. We simply exist, and that can be unbearable. For a man accustomed to affirming himself through the other, especially through the woman, this realization is devastating. He looks at himself and finds a stranger, a being who perhaps never asked what he truly feels, what he desires beyond performance, what remains when there is no one left to please, convince, seduce, or conquer. This is the moment of nausea. It is not moral regret. It is an ontological vertigo, a discomfort that comes from within, from the hole left by an identity built in the other's gaze. And now that gaze has withdrawn. Or worse, it is there, but silent, indifferent, The woman does not need to shout to provoke this collapse. She just needs to fall silent. Her silence acts like a harsh light on a room he did not wish to see illuminated. There lie the childhood fears, the unacknowledged desires, the existential voids camouflaged as self-sufficiency. And what can he do with that? Some will flee. Seek another woman who speaks, who reacts, who fills the void. Others will anesthetize themselves, work, vice, routine, distraction, anything to avoid nausea, to avoid facing himself again. But there are the few who remain, who sit on the emotional floor of their own despair and say, I don't know who I am, but I am willing to find out. And that is the beginning of the free man, because only one who can endure seeing oneself without masks is free. One who accepts discomfort as a portal and not as punishment, who looks inward and, even nauseated, chooses to build oneself. A woman's silence then ceases to be a threat. It becomes an invitation to authenticity, to shed bad faith, to face that there is no manual, no script, no excuse, only choices. And at this point he no longer thinks, why did she fall silent? He thinks, why did I need her to speak so badly? When you fall silent, he begins to, speak, but not with you, with himself, with his ghosts, with his needs. It is curious how silence can say so much without making a sound, how it can be a mirror, clean, smooth, merciless. What he sees there is not you. It is what he projects onto you. She is punishing me. She wants to manipulate me. She is hiding something. She doesn't love me anymore. Each of these sentences reveals less about you and more about him, his unresolved pains, his insecurities, his fear of abandonment, his terror of not being enough. Because silence is not a code to be deciphered. It is a space to be respected, and few men know how to deal with it. Sartre said that we are condemned to be free because we have no fixed nature. There are no ontological excuses for what we do, only choices. And in the face of a woman's silence, a man is forced to choose, confront, or project. Projecting is easier. It demands less pain, less risk. He invents a story in which you are the villain, the cold one, the schemer. A story where he is the wronged, the confused, the lost one. And in that story, he does not need to change, because the problem is you. But confronting, that is another story. Confronting demands that he stop looking at the mirror and start looking inward. Silence is dangerous because it breaks the circuit of predictability. He does not know what you think, and that despairs him, because it means you are no longer decipherable, no longer controllable, no longer in the place he had assigned you, someone who reacts. You have withdrawn from the game, and the game was what kept him safe. It is at that moment that the mirror becomes ruin. He realizes he used your presence to protect himself from his own void. And now, without you, without your speech, he stands before himself. Some men, then, will try to make you speak again, not out of love, but out of fear, because your speech is what remains of the old order. It is what allows him to keep being who he always was without changing. But you are no longer in the same place. Your silence is now a choice, not an escape, an affirmation. It is the space where you finally cease to be his projection, to be what you are in the time you choose, in the language you decide. And he, if he wants to stay, will have to learn to listen without noise, without expectation, without a manual. He will have to look at the mirror without distorting the image. And that is the hardest test of all. So far, we have spoken of him, what he feels, what he fears, what he projects. But now the question turns. And you? Are you ready to sustain your silence? Because there is one detail few mention. Falling silent also demands courage. True silence, not as tactic, not as threat, but as an authentic expression of a boundary, is an existential act, an act of freedom. Sartre wrote that man is what he makes of what was made of him, and silence, when it is not reactive but chosen, is exactly that. You ceasing to be what was expected of you, to become what you wish to be. But this has a price, the price of not being understood immediately, of being labeled cold, of losing the comfortable place of one who always explains, always justifies, always welcomes even what should be intolerable. True silence is a rupture with the narrative of sacrifice. You are no longer the woman who shouts to be heard. You are the woman who no longer shouts, because she no longer needs to prove anything. And there begins a new game, not with him, with you. Silence will take you inward, and there you may discover that you spoke too much for fear of abandonment, that you explained too much for fear of conflict, that you gave in too much for fear of loneliness. And now, in silence, all that returns. You will want to speak. You will feel the urge to explain, to soften the impact. But sustaining silence is sustaining the new version of yourself, the one who refuses to kneel to fear. And the most beautiful thing is that, at that point, what he thinks matters no longer as much. You are no longer silent to provoke a reaction. You are silent because something within you no longer accepts shrinking to fit. It is not about punishment. It is about presence. It is not absence. It is integrity. Some men will leave. Others will try to bring you back to the old dance. But those who remain, those who learn to listen without demanding, those who endure the pause without fleeing, those may be ready for something new. Because the silence you sustain with courage does not push away. It purifies. It separates what was attachment from what is love, what was control from what is choice. And then you finally understand. It matters less what he thinks when you fall silent. What matters is what you choose to do with your voice, with your time, with your being. You choose who you want to be today, and no one can take that from you.